Let us turn our attention now to the appendix of chapter 3, where we're going to move on not just addressing what is this paradox, but notions of offense on it. And where does that come from, and what does that mean? Moving into the appendix here, which he calls offense at the paradox, right? This is what we're going to look at too. And here it's an acoustical illusion, right? You're going to be rejecting this idea and offended at the paradox, which is at the same time built into the paradox. If the paradox and the understanding meet in mutual understanding of their difference, then the encounter is a happy one, like erotic love's understanding. Happy in the passion to which we have yet given no name, in which we shall not name until later. If the encounter is not in mutual understanding, then the relation is unhappy, and the understanding's unhappy love, if I dare call it that, which please note resembles only unhappy love rooted in misunderstood self-love, since the power of chance is capable of nothing here, the analogy stretches no further. We could more specifically term offense. So now we have here the idea of offense at this paradox, right? The paradox is the understanding trying to understand the different, the unknown. Yet sometimes we're unhappy with the idea that there's something unknown. Right? And so it can be a non-mutual encounter or understanding. And therefore we can have offense at the paradox. Kierkegaard points out here, at its deepest level, all offense is a suffering. Here it is similar to that of unhappy love. Even when self-love announces itself to be the rashest exploit and amazing deed, it is suffering, it is wounded, and the pain of the wound gives the illusionary expression of strength that resembles action and can easily delude, especially since self-love conceals this most of all. Indeed, even when it thrusts down the object of love, even when it self-tormentously disciplines itself to callously indifference and tortures itself in order to show indifference, even when it indulges in triumphant frivolosities over success in doing this, even then it is suffering. If you're offended at something, there's suffering involved. Even if you emerge victorious, there's a break with which you desire, and therefore there is suffering along these lines. It may not be grandiose, but it is still suffering. No matter if the offense came, he says in the middle of the paragraph 150, to the last crumb of comfort and joy from the one of the offended one, or if it made him strong, offense is nevertheless suffering. Next paragraph 150. We can, however, very well distinguish between suffering offense and active offense, yet without forgetting that suffering offense is always active to the extent that it cannot altogether allow itself to be annihilated, and active offense is always weak enough to be incapable of tearing oneself loose from the cross to which it is nailed, or to pull the arrow out which it is wounded. Right? We're always ignorant, and therefore there's offense. Now again, we see here too this Socratic argument from earlier, right? That what we have here is offense, and that this is suffering. That we have these two human impulses, and that ignorance is going to cause suffering. Once again, we go to Socrates and his argument of the two guiding and ruling principles here, right? The natural desire of pleasure and the acquired opinion of what aspires after the best, or of excellence, right? And yet how these are at war, and desire devoid of reason rules, it drags us, and we call that excess. When opinion, by the help of reason, leads us to the best, then it's temperance, right? This excess, this desire devoid of reason, this ignorance is its suffering, and this is exactly what Kierkegaard is addressing here. The sorrow that comes from the offense at the paradox, where our own ignorance of what things are lead it to one conclusion as opposed to the other. But precisely because offense is a suffering in this manner, he continues at the bottom of 50, the discovery, if it may be put this way, does not belong to the understanding, but to the paradox. For just as truth is the criteria of itself and of the false, so also is the paradox. The offense does not understand itself, but is understood by the paradox. Thus, although the offense, however it expresses itself, sounds from somewhere else, indeed from the opposite corner, nevertheless it is the paradox that resounds in it. And this, indeed, is an acoustical illusion. Right? That the fact that it sounds like we're hearing something, we're hearing an echo, and we're taking that to be the regular voice. It's an acoustical illusion, right? It's not really what we're being offended at, isn't the fact that it's true. It's that we're perceiving it as untruth. It's that we're perceiving it as something of what it's not. Right? We've got a ventriloquist over here talking out of a dummy, and we're assuming the personality of what the ventriloquist is saying belongs properly to the dummy, but we know that it's not. This is offense at the paradox. This is how we can call it an acoustical illusion. It's this sort of idea. We're suffering here because we think that the ventriloquist dummy is insulting us. But it's not. It's a ventriloquist, right? It's an illusion. And it causes us, a different sort of argument here, right? This Socratic principle that all sin is ignorance, as he says in the footnote on the bottom of 50, that sin does not understand itself in the truth, and that this does not mean that it cannot will itself in untruth. This is the argument of what's being made. Continuing on 51, 4 lines down, but if the paradox is an index and judic sui et falsi, the judge of itself and of the false, then offense can be regarded as an indirect testing of the correctness of the paradox. For offense is the erroneous accounting, is the conclusion of untruth, which their paradox thrusts away. Right? And here we have Kant and his arguments about judgments and how we make all of that. If you were to continue to look into Kant and his arguments about judgments, we're elevating that in this part. The one offended does not speak according to his own nature, but according to the nature of the paradox. Just as someone characterizing another person does not originate anything himself, but only copies the other in the wrong way. This is what a character does. So the offense is not the orientation of the understanding, far from it, for then the understanding must also have been able to originate the paradox. No, the offense comes into existence with the paradox, if it comes into existence. Here again, we have the moment. Right? We have the moment once again, where the offense at the moment emerges, right? Where the paradox, where you're standing there as untruth facing the truth, and you're offended at it, around which everything indeed revolves. Once again, we return to another one of these key terms for this work, the moment. Let us recapitulate. If we do not assume the moment, then we go back to Socrates, as we already addressed in the earlier chapters, right? And it was precisely from him that we wanted to take leave in order to discover something. If the moment is posited, the paradox is there, for therefore its most abbreviated form of the paradox can be called the moment. Right? So here, what is the moment? It's the most abbreviated form of the paradox, of wanting to think what thought itself cannot think. This is the moment. Again, another quick way of looking at it. Through the moment, the learner becomes untruth. The person who knew himself becomes confused about himself, and instead of self-knowledge, he acquires a consciousness of sin. But you're not knowing yourself, your confusion is away from the truth. Therefore, again, the term that he used philosophically is sin. For just as soon as we assume the moment, everything goes by itself. From the psychological point of view, offense will now have very many shadings within the category, and more active and more passive. To describe these is not the interest of this deliberation, but is nevertheless important to maintain that all offense in its essence is a misunderstanding of the moment, since it is indeed offense at the paradox, and the paradox, in turn, is the moment. And all offense at this thing is misunderstanding the fact that the truth is approaching the untruth. You don't want to be called the untruth. You want to be called the truth. You want to be called the knower. You want to assume you have all knowledge, but yet you can't have all knowledge, because this is the whole point of what the paradox is that you're trying to think what you cannot think. Therefore, the truth has to be outside of you, and therefore you're the untruth. And any offense at this is just an offense at not knowing what is. And it's a pushback and a reaction against this. The dialectic of the moment is not difficult. From the Socratic point of view, the moment is not to be seen. Distinguished, it does not exist, has not been, and will not come. Therefore, the learner himself is truth. And the moment, the occasion, is merely a jest, like the end sheet half title that does not essentially belong to a book. And the moment of decision is foolishness. For if the decision is posited, then, see above, the learner becomes untruth, and precisely this makes the beginning of the moment necessary. The expression of the offense is the moment is foolishness. The paradox is foolishness. If we were to be going from the Socratic point of view, that everything is recollection, and that you already know all that you will know, then the moment doesn't exist, it's foolishness. The paradox doesn't exist, it's foolishness, because again, you're recollecting. But if we're going to approach things from the non-Socratic point of view, then it's there. Next paragraph there on 52. The offense remains outside of the paradox, and the basis for that is because it is absurd. Yet, the understanding has not discovered this, since on the contrary, it is the paradox that discovered it, and now takes testimony from the offense. The understanding declares that the paradox is the absurd. Now again, this is interesting to think about how the absurd is used later by people like Camus, and this as an idea existing within atheist existentialism of Nietzsche and Sartre as well. And you could definitely draw some lines of the difference between how we would approach this same sort of idea. Because notice here the absurdity for Kierkegaard is in relation to the paradox. And it's not reduced only to the absurd. And therefore we have this definite difference, right? The offense remains outside the paradox, retains probability, whereas the paradox is the most improbable. Once again, it is not the understanding that discovers it, but the understanding merely parrots the paradox. However strange that may seem, for the paradox itself says, comedies and novels and lies must be probable. But how could I be probable? The offense remains outside the paradox. No wonder, since the paradox is the wonder. And now we're introduced to another word, wonder, right? What's being marveled at could be another expression of the paradox. The understanding has not discovered this. On the contrary, it was the paradox that ushered the understanding to the wonder stool and replies, now, what are you wondering about? It is just as you say, the amazing thing that you think, that it is an objection. But the truth in the mouth of a hypocrite is dearer to me than to hear it from the angel and an apostle. When the understanding flaunts its magnificence in comparison with the paradox, which is the most lowly and despised, the understanding has not originated in it. But the paradox itself is the originator, who hands over all the splendor to understanding, even the glittering vices. When the understanding, on 53, wants to have pity upon the paradox and to assist in the explanation, the paradox does not put up with that, but considers it appropriate for the understanding to do that. For that, not what philosophers are for, to make supernatural things ordinary and trivial, right? This is the whole point of what philosophy does. We're to take grandiose supernatural ideas that are beyond our own understanding, and to trivialize them, is to make them just part of our own understanding of the way things are. This is the venture of a philosopher. Or at least this is, an argument then. When the understanding cannot get the paradox into its head, this did not have its origin in the understanding, but the paradox itself, which was paradoxical enough to have the effrontery to call the understanding a clod and a dunce, who at best can say yes and no at the same thing, which is not good theology. So it is with the offense. Everything it says about the paradox, it has learned from the paradox. Even though, making use of this acoustical illusion, it insists that it itself has originated the paradox. This is the weirdness of offense at the paradox. It is offended at the very moment the paradox enters it. And yet it's because of the paradox and shows up with the paradox. You can't be offended at not knowing what you don't know until you're encountered with what you don't know. And yet this also shows that you didn't know. A little odd, a little confusing here. Continuing from the break at 53. But someone may be saying, you really are boring. For now you have the same story all over again. All the phrases you put in the mouth of the paradox do not belong to you at all. How could they belong to me, since they do indeed belong to the paradox? Please spare us your sophistry. You can think back of some earlier, sophists' earlier arguments, right? Is this something that could be done, trying to prove that, the universe doesn't exist, that you can't know anything because it's not there, right? That same sort of illusion and discussion that we addressed earlier on. Maybe this is what we're doing. Ah, my dear fellow, what you say does not pain me, as you perhaps think that it does. No, it pleases me immensely, for I admit that I trembled when I wrote them down. I could not recognize myself, could not imagine that I, who as a rule am so diffident and fearful, dared to write anything like that. But if they are not my phrases, tell me, whose are they? If these are not my arguments, where do they come from? Right? That you're going to be criticizing it, but where's the source of your criticism? Where's this going? Nothing is easier. The first is from Tertullian, the second is from Hamann, the third is from Hamann, the fourth is from Lactantius, and so often quoted. The fifth is from Shakespeare's comedy All Is Well That Ends Well. The sixth is from Luther. The seventh is A Lion in King Lear. As you see, I do not know my business and know how to catch you with these stolen goods. Indeed, I see it very well, but tell me, right? Interesting use of the dialectic here, right? We have two characters debating back and forth, and yet also all in the same mind of the individual, and yet we're giving the answers, right? We're looking not at Abelard, who doesn't give the answers, but we're looking at Lombard, who will give the answers, and in this sort of relation here, right? Where we're debating, and yet we're leading down to the conclusion. We're using a high form of scholastic dialectic here, even though it doesn't seem so obvious and plain. I see it all very well on 54, but tell me this. Have not all these men talked about a relation of the paradox to offense? And will you please notice that they are not the offended ones, but the very ones who held firmly to the paradox and yet spoke as if it were the offended ones? And offense cannot come up with a more striking expression than that. It is not particular of the paradox, thus seems the taking bread from the mouth of the offense, and by making it an unremunerative art that has no reward for the trouble, but is just as odd as the opponent, who absent-mindedly does not attack the author, but defends him. Does it not seem so to you? Yet offense has one advantage. It points up the difference more clearly, for in that happy passion to which we have yet given a name, the difference is the fact on good terms with the understanding. The difference is necessary in order to be united in some third, but the difference was precisely this, that the understanding surrendered itself as the paradox gave itself. And the understanding lies in this unhappy passion that no doubt will receive a name. But this is the last part of it. Even though my happiness does not have a name, if only I am happy, I ask no more. So this becomes part of the interesting idea, is that the offense at the paradox comes about with the paradox. And yet those who can best speak about the offense of the paradox are not those who are offended at the paradox. Yet again, another paradox. We don't quite have a name about what this all is like, but this is the whole process of trying to become a learner. This is what it is to learn things from a non-Socratic point of view, and this is how this idea needs to be advanced. At least this is what Kierkegaard is postulating here in the appendix, a great example of dialectical learning and understanding, where the answers are given, not just the questions.